Now, a great question that came in through the AUA forum was, can plants be vectors of disease? Now, the question was specifically posed in terms of vectors of disease for humans, but more broadly, I think the question is very interesting. Can plants act as vectors of disease, and how do they interact in that role?
So definitely, plants are good vectors for some viruses of insects. I'm not aware of any documented case where a plant has been a vector for a human disease, although there are some kinds of food poisoning, like some of the E. coli that have been a problem in spinach and lettuce in recent years. Evidently, those can be taken up by plants through the roots and get into the plant. So there can be bacterial examples. For viruses, there's some really cool stories about viruses being vectors or plants being vectors for insect viruses. So my favorite one is the rosy apple aphid. So this aphid has two morphs, a winged state and a non-winged state. And the winged ones obviously can move from plant to plant. When they land on a plant, they are infected with the virus and they deposit the virus in the plant. The virus doesn't replicate in the plant, but it moves through that leaf. And then the aphid begins to have offspring, and its offspring don't have wings because they're not infected with the virus. So the virus is not transmitted vertically. And they're bigger and they have more offspring, but then pretty soon the plant gets really, really crowded, and eventually one of those offspring will take up the virus. Just by happenstance, there's a little bit of virus in the plant because it was deposited in by the original aphid. And when they take it up, then they develop the wings and they move off to a new plant and start the whole process over. So that's definitely a mutualistic virus for the aphids because it gives them a way to move.
So it provides a trigger for high population density, right? So that presumably that's a degradation of the food source that then would suggest that the aphids should move on.
Yeah, but the way that it happens is because eventually somebody will take up the virus.
So I think in animal diseases we tend to think of a vector as somewhere where the pathogen actually multiplies within that vector, as opposed to transport hosts, which would just carry. So in the case of the cabbage and the things, they're just carrying E. coli or something like that.
Right, that's right. It's not replicating.
But in some of them, would there be replicate? There will be
insect, yeah. So there are a number of plant insect viruses, and actually, we've never been sure whether they're insect viruses or plant viruses because they replicate in both those. Like tomato spotted wilt virus is one of the worst viruses in the world right now. I mean, it infects almost everything, and it replicates in its insect host and in the plant.
Yeah.
So who's the vector and who's the host? They're kind of both. But in general, that's not very common. In plant viruses, most of them, what we call vectors, don't have any replication.
Okay,
vectors.
that's interesting.
So there's an interesting distinction, of course, as you said, but there are some cases where humans do get diseases from replication of a parasite in the plant. And really great examples are fungi replicating on plant materials that we then eat. So ergot of rye is a really wonderful example. It's called St. Anthony's fire in Europe. It causes these tremors and problems in the appendages. It was suggested to be the causative agent for the madness that we saw in Salem in the 1600s because people ate infected rye. It is the fungus inside it is the same fungus from which we originally derived LSD back in the 1930s. So what the fungus is doing is living inside the rye or corn and different plants, producing a lot of alkaloids which have an effect on mammalian herbivores. So the plant has cooperation with the fungus to prevent it being eaten by a herbivore. When we eat it, the consequence of which is we have these hallucinations. And the last example was in France in 1952 when we saw this mass outbreak because somebody illegally sold infected rye. And one great story from that, or maybe not so great, is some 12-year-old girl trying to kill her mother with a kitchen knife because the whole town had this mass hallucination. It's really an impressive agent, but not a traditional vector story.
But a good story nevertheless. It's a fungal toxin then that's causing the disease. So the fungus isn't actually infecting the humans per se, but it's a toxin that's produced.